I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to begin my contribution this evening by moving an amendment to the referral motion, and that amendment is to delete all the words after committee. Mr Speaker, I have to say that it's a measure that I take out of frustration and out of surprise that the Minister who's just resumed his seat is probably the person that I would have considered prior to this evening the least likely member of this House to use a process for the consideration of legislation that was unnecessary. That Minister has been a stickler for good process in the past, has prided himself and chided others on their abuse of a process which is unnecessary, has hung out till the last nth degree of time in opposition. We won't worry about those particular policy issues, but in opposition to the unnecessary use of urgency, of extending select committee sitting times when it wasn't necessary. But here we have that very same Minister using what I consider to be the proper process of Parliament and Select Committee for an exceptional circumstance in what is clearly not an exceptional circumstance. Making pseudoephedrine and ephedrine contained medicines into prescription-only drugs, changing the classification of thalidomide and extending the use of the controls over drug paraphernalia is not something which needs extended sitting time, and I am gobsmacked that that Minister has changed his behaviour so quickly, clearly at the determination of the national government. I think it's unnecessary. And we should stand up for it, and I urge the Minister to do what he has for many years lectured others about doing in this House, a man who used to be of principle but is now moderating that measure of principle. Having said that, Mr Speaker, I want to say that Labor supports the referral of this bill to Select Committee, and one of the reasons is because we want to play our part in what I think will be a near unanimous decision of this Parliament. We want to play our part in doing everything we can to stop the damage in our families and in our communities, in our society that is done by P. Everything we can to reduce the use of P and therefore reduce the damage that is done to individuals and their families by that use, Labor will support. I have grave doubts about whether this bill will do that, but why don't we hand it over to the experts who will be able to appear before the Select Committee, who will give us the benefit of their wisdom. So that's why we want to support this bill to go to a Select Committee to hear it. The other concern I have, Mr Speaker, about this is that there is a real contradiction when we have this great leap forward. Let's make every New Zealander get a prescription for what is over 20% of the cold and flu medications because of the ingredients they contain and the possibility that they will be used for manufacturing P. But at the same time, when we know that the majority of P is manufactured from imported ingredients, we are cutting back the resourcing for police and customs to do the job of protecting our borders against the importation of this material. Mr Speaker, clearly another consideration that I urge the Select Committee to keep in their minds is the additional cost that this will impose on ordinary New Zealanders who have done nothing wrong other than having a bad cold and wanting to get rid of it in a hurry, wanting to get on that ad, sitting at the bus stop, not sneezing over the person next to them who now has got that very bad cold. That's the worst that most New Zealanders will have done. They will have caught a very bad cold. They want to take some medication to get rid of it in a hurry. They will now have to get a prescription, and because they need to go to the doctor to get a prescription, they'll have to pay for it as well. So we've got quite an additional financial cost on individuals at the time when more and more New Zealanders are feeling financial pressure. So we've got more people out of work, we've got people with reduced hours, we haven't got the pay increases that we might have hoped for in past days, but we're going to load another cost onto people. This will be clearly a bit of a challenge for some people, we know, because in many parts of the country it's very difficult to get in to see a doctor for quite some time. The waiting lists for doctors are increasing. Some people who have just moved to different parts of the country, Wainui-o-Mata, Timaru, Levin, those places have closed their doctor's book. So if you're new to town, you can't get in to see a doctor at all. So I'm not quite sure how those people are going to be able to get on in getting their prescriptions. And of course, the even bigger concern is the fact that one of the significant positive contributors to supporting people who might have drug and alcohol addictions is being taken away from them, and that is our mental health and drug and alcohol treatment centres. My colleague Ian Lees-Galloway, who I hope has an opportunity to contribute in the debate later on this evening, has recently asked the Minister, who's just introduced this legislation, about the cuts to the St Mark's Adult Drug and Alcohol Treatment Centre in Blenheim, the Care New Zealand Clinic in Otahuhu and the Ashburn Clinic in Dunedin. Those are the places that give support to people who want to get away from their drug and alcohol addictions. Those are the places that are laying off staff because of funding cuts signed off by the Minister of Health. So here we have the so-called great commitment from the Prime Minister and the Honourable Peter Dunn. We're going to wage a war on P. We're going to ensure that ordinary New Zealanders have to go to the doctor and get a prescription in order to get their cold and flu medication, and at the same time they are taking away resourcing for police and customs officers, and they're cutting the funding for drug and alcohol treatment. How does that package make sense? I don't understand how that can possibly be a serious war on P when the very parts of the picture that actually make a difference are being taken away. Mr. Speaker, a couple of other things that I'd like to mention. First is the concern that the Honourable Chris Finlayson has raised in regard to the legislation, because in his view it raises a Bill of Rights issue, because it does set out a presumption for supply. So the message that Peter Dunn is giving to the good New Zealanders, not only in his electorate but in mine as well, is if they are going to the chemist and asking for a packet of whatever medication that happens to have pseudoephedrine or ephedrine in it, then the presumption from the government is that they're buying that in order to manufacture and supply P. I think that Chris Finlayson's concerns are justified. Most New Zealanders don't do that. Mr. Speaker, the final point that I want to raise is in regard to the regulatory impact statement. Coming from a government that has led the charge on regulatory reform, the Honourable Rodney Hyde must be a bit embarrassed by this regulatory impact statement. The regulatory impact statement is meant to set out regulatory options. It's meant to look at all the options and the impact of those regulations. And what this regulatory impact statement says is there are no other regulatory options proposed at this time because the government's already decided this course of action. This is what the regulatory impact statement says. There are no other regulatory options proposed at this time since government has already decided this course of action. What sort of a regulatory impact statement is this? Their job is to provide all the options, and what they are saying is we didn't bother because the government has already taken its course of action and made the decision. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that this intent behind the legislation is sound, and as I said at the beginning of my speech tonight, Labor is 100% behind any moves to get the scourge of P and the harm it does in our family communities out of our society. This bill raises more questions than answers, and I look